Sam Carter, an 85-year-old Marine veteran, visits the Lexington VA weekly, clutching a worn leather folder with proof of his heroic service in Vietnam. Mocked and ignored, his Bronze Star and discharge papers are dismissed as unverifiable. Rachel Monroe, a young intern, senses the truth in his quiet dignity and uncovers a 1969 article confirming Sam saved Lieutenant Richard Halverson's life during the Battle of Sanh. As she digs deeper, contacting the now-retired General Halverson, the VA's apathy unravels. What happens next could rewrite decades of forgotten valor, or bury it forever. Will Sam's truth finally be heard? Please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to honor veterans like Sam Carter, whose stories deserve to be told. Share names and stories of overlooked heroes in the comments. Together, let's restore their dignity and ensure their sacrifices echo across generations. Thank you for remembering. The sharp winter air sliced through the Lexington Veterans Affairs Office as the automatic doors parted with a mechanical sigh, ushering in a gust of snow and an old man who seemed untouched by the cold's bite. Sam Carter, 85, carried himself with a quiet dignity, his heavy brown wool coat bearing the weight of too many seasons. Snowflakes clung stubbornly to his worn leather boots, each step deliberate, as if the years had taught him to measure every movement. A hand-knit scarf, its colors faded but still neatly tucked into his coat, spoke of a long-ago care, perhaps from a loved one whose hands had woven it decades prior. Under his arm, he cradled a leather folder so weathered its edges had softened like the memory it held, the latch barely clinging to life. To Sam, it wasn't just a folder, it was a vault of his past, a fragile tether to a time when his steps were quicker, his purpose clearer, and the world saw him differently. Inside the office, the air was stale, heavy with the hum of bureaucracy and the faint smell of industrial cleaner. Sam approached the front desk, where a young woman sat behind a glass partition, her eyes fixed on her computer screen, her fingers moving mechanically. "Take a number, sir. Kiosk to your right," she said, her voice flat, devoid of warmth, as if she'd spoken the same words 1,000 times that morning. Sam offered a polite nod, his weathered face betraying no frustration, though a flicker of weariness passed through his eyes. He was too accustomed to this indifference to expect anything else. Turning to the touchscreen kiosk, he pressed a calloused finger against the cold screen, his hand steady despite the slight tremble of age. The machine whirred, spitting out a small ticket, number 38. He scanned the room, his gaze settling on rows of plastic chairs, some occupied by younger veterans hunched over their phones, their faces lit by the glow of screens, others by older men buried under layers of coats, their eyes distant. Sam chose a seat along the far wall, lowering himself carefully, his knees groaning under the weight of time. The folder rested on his lap, a silent companion. A few seats away, two men in their 30s noticed him. One, in a camo hoodie, leaned toward his friend, who sported a backward ball cap. "That guy again?" the first muttered, his voice carrying just enough to sting. "What's he even doing here? Thinks he's still in uniform or something? Chasing free coffee?" The other smirked, his chuckle low but cutting. "Yeah, probably thinks he's a hero." The words hung in the air, sharp and careless, slicing through the hum of the waiting room. Sam heard every syllable, each one landing like a quiet blow to his chest. His fingers tightened briefly on the folder, but his face remained still, his eyes fixed on the papers in his lap. He'd learned long ago to let such words pass, to bury the ache they stirred. Inside him, though, a tide of memories churned. Moments of gunfire, of blood-soaked snow, of comrades who never made it home. He wasn't here for coffee or glory. He was here because this folder, these fragile papers, were all he had left to prove he'd once been more than a shadow in a waiting room. Sam opened the folder with a tenderness that belied his rough hands. Inside lay the remnants of a life the world had forgotten. A Bronze Star citation, its ink faded but still legible, whispered of courage under fire. Discharge papers, their typewritten lines smudged by time, marked the end of a chapter he'd never fully closed. A black and white photograph, creased from years of folding and unfolding, showed three young Marines standing in snow, their arms slung around each other, their smiles defiant against the cold. Sam's eyes lingered on the photo, his mind drifting to those boys, his brothers, not by blood, but by bond. He could still hear their laughter, feel the weight of their trust. The photo's edges were soft, threatening to tear, but to Sam, it was sacred, a relic of a time when he was unbreakable. Across the room, Rachel Monroe, a 29-year-old intern studying public administration, glanced up from her desk. She'd seen countless veterans pass through these doors, each with their own stories etched into their faces. But something about Sam caught her. Maybe it was the way he held that folder, as if it were a piece of his soul, or the quiet resilience in his posture despite the weight of his years. Her heart stirred with an unease she couldn't name, a sense that the system, with its forms and numbers, was failing to see something vital. She didn't know his story, but the reverence in his hands told her it mattered. She made a mental note to keep an eye on him, a small act of care in a place that often felt devoid of it. In that moment, Sam was more than a number to her. He was a mystery, a life waiting to be understood. "Number 38, window 2, the overhead speaker crackled, pulling Sam from his memories. He rose slowly, his knees protesting with each movement, his hands steadying himself on the chair's arms. The folder remained tucked under his arm, held as carefully as one might cradle a child. He moved toward the counter with a quiet determination, each step a testament to a resolve that time hadn't eroded. At window 2, a young clerk named Dana B. waited, her neat hair and name badge giving her an air of efficiency. Her eyes flicked to the folder, then back to her screen, her expression blank. "Claim number?" she asked, her tone as mechanical as the kiosk's hum, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Sam's voice was soft but clear, tempered by years of patience. "I don't have a number," he said, "just these." With a reverence that seemed to slow the air around him, he placed the folder on the counter, its worn leather stark against the sterile surface. To him, it wasn't just a collection of papers. It was his truth, his proof, his plea to be seen. Dana's eyes lingered on the folder for a moment, but her face betrayed no curiosity, no recognition of the weight it carried. To her, it was just another task in a long day. But for Sam, it was everything, a fragile bridge between the man he'd been and the world that had moved on without him. Sam Carter stood before the counter, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he eased open the worn leather folder. The papers inside were creased, their edges yellowed by time, carrying the weight of decades. He looked up, hoping for a flicker of understanding from the clerk, Dana, whose eyes barely grazed the documents before returning to her screen. Her voice was flat, mechanical, as she spoke without looking at him. "If you don't have a claim number, I can't help you," she said, her words sharp enough to cut through the faint hope Sam had carried into the office. He tried to explain, his voice low but steady, gesturing to the papers. "These are my discharge papers. My Bronze Star citation is in there too. I served with—" But Dana cut him off, her tone clipped, like she'd heard this story too many times before. "Sir, if it's not in the system, it's not verifiable. You'll need a commanding officer's confirmation or digital verification from the archive. We don't process hand-carried documents." Sam froze, the words landing like a blow he hadn't braced for. His commanding officer, First Lieutenant Richard Halverson, had been gone for nearly 30 years, his life snuffed out in the chaos of a long-ago war. Sam's mind flickered to that night, the jungle's oppressive silence before the ambush, the way the world had erupted into fire and screams. He could still feel the weight of Halverson's body slung over his shoulder, the man's shallow breaths hot against his neck as he dragged him through the mud. But how could he explain that to this clerk, whose eyes never left her screen? "My CO," Sam said, his voice catching. "He's been gone nearly 30 years now." Dana's response was immediate, devoid of warmth. "Then I suggest you file an appeal. The kiosk's over there under the blue sign." She pointed without looking, her attention already shifting to the next person in line. Sam stood rooted to the spot, the folder still open in his hands, its contents exposed like a wound. The moment stretched, heavy and awkward, as he struggled to process the dismissal. Behind him, a line of people waited, their impatience palpable. A soft snort broke the silence, followed by a voice, low but cutting. "Betty printed those at the library," it said, dripping with mockery. Another voice chimed in, barely muffled. "That Bronze Star citation? Straight off Google. Probably thinks if he shows up enough times, we'll just salute him out of pity." The words stung, each one a barb that pierced Sam's quiet dignity. He turned his head slightly, just enough to see the two men in line, their smirk barely concealed. But he didn't respond. His hands moved slowly, deliberately, closing the folder as if sealing away something sacred, something no one in this sterile office could understand. Without a word, he stepped aside and made his way back to the row of vinyl chairs in the waiting area. His steps were slower now, each one heavy with the weight of rejection, not just from the clerk, but from a system that seemed to erase the very existence of his service. Across the room, Rachel Monroe sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. She hadn't meant to overhear, but the exchange was impossible to ignore. Her eyes followed Sam as he walked, his shoulders slightly hunched, not from age but from something deeper, a burden that seemed to press down on him with every step. There was something in the way he moved, not broken exactly, but worn, like a man carrying a load no one else could see. And that folder, he'd set it down on the chair beside him with such care, as if it held more than just paper, as if it were a piece of his soul. Rachel's heart tugged, a quiet ache she couldn't shake. She glanced back at her screen, where intake forms awaited her review, their endless fields and checkboxes saw a reminder of the system's cold efficiency. She knew how it worked. If someone wasn't in the database, they were a ghost, a blank page in a world that demanded digital proof. But as Sam sat down and opened his folder again, his fingers tracing the edges of the papers with a tenderness that spoke of loss and memory, Rachel felt a growing certainty that the system was wrong. Not in a loud, obvious way, but in a quiet, insidious one. And the mistake was sitting right there, wrapped in the silence of a man who'd carried 70 years of dust and pain. That night in Sam Carter's small apartment in Lexington, the air was bitter, the cold seeping through the cracks of the old wooden window frames, rattling them with every gust. Inside, a single lamp cast a soft amber glow, its light pooling around the recliner where Sam sat, hunched slightly forward. The rest of the apartment was shrouded in shadow, silent except for the faint hum of the heater and the occasional creak of the floorboards, groaning under the weight of time. The leather folder lay open on his lap, its contents spread across a small table beside him like relics from a forgotten era. He reached for a photograph, its edges frayed, the black and white image grainy but vivid in his mind. 3 young Marines stood shoulder to shoulder, rifles slung across their backs, their faces flushed not with shame, but with the bite of cold, snow piled around them nearly waist deep. Sam's thumb lingered over the figure in the center, himself at 27, his uniform crisp, his grin wide, his eyes blazing with a vitality that felt like a stranger's now. He was alive then, not just alert, but burning with the reckless energy of youth, undaunted by the horrors that lay ahead. His gaze shifted to the man on the right, First Lieutenant Richard Halverson, barely 24, fresh from officer school with a voice that carried too much confidence and boots that gleamed with untested pride. Sam could still hear him, his shouts cutting through the chaos of that night at Keeson, his commands steady even as the world around them dissolved into madness. Sam closed his eyes, and it was February 9th, 1968, all over again. The jungle had fallen silent, the kind of stillness that made your skin crawl, the birds gone, the trees holding their breath. Then the ambush hit, the world splitting open with the roar of mortars, their fiery trails streaking through the night like vengeful gods. The men scattered, diving for cover in the mud, their screams swallowed by the deafening chaos. Halverson had been hit early, shrapnel tearing into his lower back, his lung collapsing with a sickening wheeze. Sam could still feel the ground beneath him as he sprinted through the hail of bullets, dragging Halverson toward the tree line, the lieutenant's blood soaking into his uniform, hot and slick. Bullets snapped inches above his head, but he didn't stop. Couldn't stop, not until every man was accounted for. Halverson had refused medevac, his voice weak but stubborn, insisting he'd stay until the last of his men were safe. Sam's hands tightened around the photograph, his chest heavy with the memory. He hadn't just carried Haldag in that moment. He'd carried the weight of their shared survival, the unspoken promise between men who'd seen too much to ever be the same. The folder, the papers, the Bronze Star citation, they weren't just documents. They were proof of a life lived, of sacrifices made, of a night when the world had tried to break him and failed. And yet, here he was, in a fluorescent-lit office, dismissed by a system that couldn't see him, mocked by strangers who thought his pain was a performance. The injustice of it burned, not as anger, but as a quiet, aching sorrow that settled deep in his bones. He set the photograph down, his fingers lingering as if reluctant to let go, and stared into the amber light, wondering if the world would ever remember what he could never forget. The icy wind tore through the valley, slicing into Sam Carter's skin as he trudged forward, his boots sinking into the snow until they were sodden and frozen. Each step a battle against the cold that gnawed at his bones. His hands, raw and blistered from gripping his rifle, stung with every movement, and his legs had long since gone numb, as if they belonged to someone else. Yet he pressed on, driven by a force he couldn't name, a stubborn refusal to let the darkness claim him. Sam survived that day, though the curse was etched into his soul. Others weren't so lucky. Tyson Hall, just 21, a quiet kid from South Carolina with a shy smile, didn't make it. Corporal Tyson Hall had taken a round to the chest during the chaotic fallback, his life slipping away in Sam's arms as the chopper's blades finally roared to life, lifting them from the blood-soaked ground. The weight of Tyson's body, the warmth fading from his friend's frame, haunted Sam every day since. Guilt clung to him like frost, a relentless whisper that he should have done more, should have been faster, should have died instead. He never forgave himself for surviving, but he held on to one thing, a single photograph, creased and worn, the only image he had of the three of them, Sam, Tyson, and Halverson, together, their faces young and unburdened, unaware of the hell that awaited. Now, over 50 years later, that photo lay tucked in a faded folder, untouched by anyone but Sam, a relic of a life no one seemed to care about anymore. He sat alone in his small apartment, the hum of the radiator barely drowning out the silence that pressed against him. His fingers, gnarled by time, traced the edges of a Bronze Star citation, the ink so faint it was nearly invisible. He didn't need to read it. Every word was seared into his memory, as vivid as the cold that had gripped him that day. The weight of his brothers' lives, the deafening silence that followed the gunfire. People at the VA assumed he was there for a handout, money, benefits, some kind of reward for his service. They didn't understand. Sam wasn't chasing a paycheck. He was chasing something far more precious. His name, erased from the official records, as if he'd never existed, as if the sacrifices he'd made were nothing but a ghost story. Without that record, there would be no military honors, no burial beside his brothers, no flag draped over his casket. Time was slipping away, and with it, the chance to reclaim the truth of who he was. Across town, Rachel Monroe sat hunched over her kitchen table, the blue glow of her laptop casting shadows across her face in the quiet of the evening. A cup of tea, now cold and forgotten, sat beside her, untouched for hours. Her roommate had long since gone to bed, but Rachel's mind was a storm of thoughts, her fingers racing across the keyboard as she typed, Sam Carter, USMC 1968. She hadn't meant to dive this deep. As an intern at the VA, her job was simple. Log forms, file paperwork, and stay out of the way. But something about that old man had lodged itself in her heart. The way he clutched that worn folder, as if it were the only thing tethering him to the world. The quiet pain in his eyes. It had followed her all day, refusing to let go. The system had spit out a cold, clinical response. No record found. But Rachel had seen enough to know the system could lie, that it wasn't infallible. She adjusted her glasses, her brow furrowed as she scrolled past the usual noise. Genealogy sites, obituaries, articles about younger veterans. Then a faint glimmer caught her eye, a scanned image, grainy and smudged, from the Lexington Herald, dated March 1969. She clicked to enlarge it, her breath catching. The headline read, Local Marine cited for bravery at Quaison. The print was faded, but the name was unmistakable. Corporal Sam Carter. In the second paragraph, a detail that sent her heart racing. Carter had reportedly carried a wounded officer, Lieutenant R. Halverson, through enemy fire to safety during a brutal February offensive, refusing evacuation until every wounded man was accounted for. Rachel's pulse quickened. Halverson. She opened a new tab and searched the name. The results painted a vivid picture. Richard Halverson, former lieutenant, later promoted to General Richard T. Halverson, decorated with a Bronze Star with V device, a Silver Star, and once Deputy Commander of Pacific Forces, now retired, living in Virginia, and most importantly, still alive. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling. The pieces were starting to fit, at least the ones she could verify. A newspaper article from 1969 and a living general who might remember Sam Carter. And yet, the VA database told a different story. No record of Sam Carter's service, no medals, no unit affiliation, no discharge papers. It didn't make sense. She grabbed her notebook, her pen scratching furiously as she jotted down every detail. 2nd Battalion, 26th Marines, Operation Quezon, dates, the newspaper citation, names, cross-references. If this was true, if Sam Carter had saved a decorated general's life in one of the bloodiest campaigns of the Vietnam War, only to be accused of fabricating his service, the silence wasn't just a clerical error. It was a betrayal, a shameful erasure of a man's legacy. Rachel's fingers hovered over the keyboard, her resolve hardening. She pulled up a government archive database, one most interns avoided like the plague. It was clunky, outdated, only half digitized, a digital graveyard of forgotten files. But somewhere in its depths might be the key to unlocking Sam's truth. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. Maybe a transfer record, a field report with a scribbled name, a fleeting mention of a Marine who'd carried his brothers through hell. What she did know was this. Sam Carter wasn't asking for money or glory. He was asking to be remembered, to have his name restored to the history he had fought for. And no matter what the system said, or Rachel wasn't going to let that request go unanswered. The cursor pulsed steadily at the bottom of Rachel Monroe's email draft, a silent metronome ticking away her hesitation. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, caught in a moment of doubt that felt heavier than the words she'd carefully crafted. The subject line was stark, just 2 words. Sam Carter. She'd written the message twice, deleted it, rewritten it, and revised it again, chasing a tone that was precise yet respectful, direct yet deferential. This wasn't just any email, it was addressed to General Richard T. Halverson, a retired 4-star general, once the Deputy Commander of Pacific Forces, a man whose name carried the weight of decades of service. And, if the fated 1969 newspaper article she'd found was true, a man whose life had been saved by a Marine named Sam Carter, a Marine now left forgotten, lingering in the lobby of the Lexington VA office like a ghost no one could see. Rachel's eyes scanned the screen again, her heart a quiet drumbeat in her chest. The words felt like a tightrope she was walking blindfolded. Dear General Halverson, my name is Rachel Monroe, and I'm an intern at the Veterans Affairs Office in Lexington, Kentucky. I'm reaching out because of a veteran, Sam Carter, who has visited our office repeatedly, seeking acknowledgement for his service. Our records, however, show no trace of him. While researching, I came across a 1969 article from the Lexington Herald detailing a Corporal Sam Carter who, during the Battle of Quezon in 1968, carried a wounded officer, Lieutenant Halverson, to safety under heavy enemy fire. If you are that officer, sir, I believe Mr. Carter's heroic actions and his current neglect by our system deserve urgent attention. Any information or support you could provide would mean the world to him and to us. Respectfully, Rachel Monroe. She leaned back in her chair, her breath shallow, as if the weight of the message might collapse her lungs. This wasn't just about protocol or procedure. It was about Sam Carter, a man whose quiet dignity had struck her from the moment she'd met him. She could still picture him in the VA lobby, his worn jacket hanging loosely on his frame, his eyes carrying a kind of patient sorrow that made her chest ache. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't demanded anything. He'd just asked, in a voice soft as weathered wood, if someone could check his records again. I was there, he'd said, and those 3 words had lodged in Rachel's mind like shrapnel. She'd seen the article later that day, yellowed and brittle in the library's archives, and it had felt like fate. Sam Carter wasn't just a name on a page. He was a man who'd carried another to safety, who'd risked everything and now stood erased by a system that should have honored him. Her finger lingered over the send button, a tiny green icon that felt like a cliff's edge. What if the general didn't respond? What if he didn't even remember? Worse, what if her supervisor found out she'd gone behind his back? But the image of Sam's tired eyes, the way his hands had trembled slightly as he handed her his faded ID, pushed her forward. She clicked send, and the email vanished into the digital ether with a faint whoosh. For a moment, she felt weightless, as if she'd let go of something heavy and precious all at once. Less than an hour later, Rachel was sorting through intake logs at her desk, the monotony of the task a thin shield against her racing thoughts. She couldn't stop wondering if she'd overstepped, if she'd been reckless. A tap on her shoulder jolted her from her spiral. She turned to find Ron Hastings, her supervisor, standing behind her, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. His face was a mask of controlled irritation, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Rachel," he said, his voice low but sharp, "I hear you've been digging into service records. Off the books." Her throat tightened, but she held his gaze, searching for the right words. Before she could speak, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "This isn't your job. You're not some detective playing hero. Whatever you think you're doing, stop it. Now, before you make a mess we can't clean up." Rachel's heart pounded, a mix of fear and defiance swirling in her chest. "I just thought," she started, her voice quieter than she intended. "You're an intern," Ron cut in, his tone like a blade. "Not an investigator. If you want Abaya to keep working here, you'd better remember that." He didn't wait for her response, turning on his heel and striding away, leaving her in the hum of the office, printers whirring, phones ringing, the world moving on as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Rachel sat frozen, her hands trembling slightly as she stared at her computer screen. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. Ron's words echoed in her mind, but so did Sam's. "I was there." She could still see the way his shoulders had slumped when she told him gently that his name wasn't in the system. She'd seen the flicker of resignation in his eyes, as if he'd expected it but hoped for better. That moment had drawn a line in her mind, a line between following orders and doing what was right. She wasn't sure where this path would lead, but she knew she stood on Sam's side of it. She reopened her browser, her fingers moving almost on instinct. The general might not reply. He might not even read her email. But Rachel couldn't shake the certainty that Sam Carter wasn't lying. He wasn't chasing glory or handouts. All he wanted was for someone to look him in the eye and say, "We remember. We see you." A moment Rachel, young and untested as she was, felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders. She was willing to risk her job, her reputation, her future, to give him that. The next morning, the Lexington VA office hummed with its usual rhythm, burnt coffee wafting from the break room, printers grinding out endless forms, the low murmur of conversations blending into a familiar drone. Rachel moved through her tasks mechanically, her mind still tethered to the email she'd sent. Ron Hastings was halfway through his first cup of coffee, the steam curling lazily upward, when the receptionist appeared at his office door. Her face was taut, her voice hesitant. "Mr. Hastings," she said, "there's someone on the line. Says it's urgent." Ron didn't look up from his paperwork. "Tell them to file a request like everyone else," he said, his tone clipped. The receptionist shifted uncomfortably. "He says his name is General Richard Halverson." Ron froze, the name hitting him like a sudden gust of cold air. He set his coffee down with deliberate care, as if a single wrong move might shatter something. "As in General Halverson?" he asked, his voice betraying a flicker of unease. She nodded. 4-star. Retired. He said it's about a veteran. Sam Carter. Ron's pulse quickened, his hand slightly clammy as he reached for the phone. He cleared his throat, steadying himself. "This is Ron Hastings, Veterans Affairs, Lexington branch," he said, striving for professionalism. The voice on the other end was deep, commanding, unmistakably forged in the crucible of military life. "Mr. Hastings, this is General Richard Halverson. I'm calling regarding Corporal Sam Carter." Ron's mind raced, fragments of Rachel's questions and his own sharp reprimand flashing through his thoughts. He gripped the receiver tighter, unsure whether this call was a lifeline or a landmine. All he knew was that something was shifting, something bigger than his office, bigger than his authority, and Sam Carter, a man he'd barely noticed before, was at the center of it. The sterile hum of the office surrounded Ron Hastings as he sat at his desk, the weight of the morning's events pressing down on him like a storm cloud. He had just hung up the phone, the dial tone still echoing in his ears, sharp and final, after General Richard T. Halverson's voice had sliced through him like a blade. The general's words weren't just a reprimand, they were a reckoning, each syllable heavy with the weight of a truth Ron had failed to see. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at the unopened folder on his desk, left there by Rachel, the young intern whose quiet diligence had uncovered what his entire staff had overlooked. Shame coiled in his gut, twisting tighter with every replay of the general's cold, measured tone. You've accused a decorated Marine of fabrication. You've humiliated a hero. Ron's mind churned, replaying the conversation. He had stammered through excuses, his voice faltering under the general's unrelenting authority. I wasn't aware of the details, he had said, the words feeble even as they left his lips. He hadn't known, hadn't bothered to know. The realization stung, sharp and bitter. For weeks, Sam Carter had been coming to their office, a quiet figure in a worn Marine jacket, clutching a leather folder filled with proof of a life of service. Ron had dismissed him, like so many others in the office had, as just another old man with a story. The whispers in the break room, the eye rolls, the muttered complaints about another vet with a tall tale. Ron hadn't stopped them. He hadn't questioned the system's gaps or pushed his team to dig deeper. Now, the general's voice rang in his head. A young intern had the integrity to do what your entire staff failed to listen. Mom, he glanced around the office where the usual chaos continued. Phones ringing, chairs scraping, names called over the PA system. But it all felt distant, like a scene playing out underwater. His colleagues moved through their routines, oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred. Ron's eyes fell back to the folder, its edges worn from being carried so faithfully by Sam Carter. His fingers hesitated, then reached for it, trembling as they brushed the leather. What had he missed? What kind of man had he so carelessly judged? The folder felt heavier than it should, as if it held not just papers, but the weight of a life that had once walked through hell and emerged a hero. Across town, in a small apartment tucked away from the noise of the city, Sam Carter sat on his porch, wrapped in the faded green of his old Marine jacket. The fabric was threadbare in places, the insignia dulled by time, but it was still his, a second skin that carried the weight of memory. He held a chipped mug in his hands, the words, "The few, the proud," barely legible on its surface. The coffee inside had long gone cold, but he sipped it anyway, staring out at the quiet street where snow dusted the edges of the sidewalk. His breath hung in the air, visible in the chill of the Thursday morning. At 81, Sam moved slowly, his body a map of aches and scars, each one a story he rarely told. The wound in his gut from kissing in 1968 had long healed, but the memory of that day, the jungle's suffocating heat, the crack of gunfire, the weight of a dying man on his shoulder, still lingered, sharp and vivid. Sam had no idea that across town, a phone call had just changed everything. He didn't know that General Halverson, the man he'd carried to safety all those years ago, had just torn through the bureaucracy like a hurricane, demanding justice for a forgotten hero. Sam's visits to the Lexington VA office had become a ritual of disappointment, each trip met with skeptical glances and dismissive words. He'd grown used to it, the muttered comments, the impatience in the receptionist's voice, the way his folder of carefully preserved documents was barely glanced at. But he kept coming back, not out of hope, but out of duty. Those papers, combat reports, a newspaper clipping from '69, a faded military newsletter were proof of who he was, of what he'd done. They were all he had left of a time when his name meant something. That morning, as Sam made his way to the VA office, the cold bit at his knuckles, and his boots scuffed softly against the snow-dusted sidewalk. His scarf was wrapped tightly around his neck, and the leather folder was tucked under his arm. As always, the glass doors of the VA hissed shut behind him, sealing out the winter air, and he stepped into the familiar lobby. But something was different. The usual undercurrent of impatience was gone. No one smirked or whispered. The receptionist, usually curt, supervisor looked up with an expression that caught him off guard, something soft, almost reverent. "Good morning, Mr. Carter," she said, her voice steady and warm. Sam blinked, his weathered face betraying a flicker of confusion. "Morning," he replied quietly, nodding as he moved toward a seat. The lobby was quieter than usual, the air charged with something Sam couldn't quite place. People were watching him, not with the usual indifference or irritation, but with curiosity, maybe even respect. Whispers floated around him, soft and careful, like they were speaking about someone who mattered. Sam settled into a chair, resting the folder on his lap with the same deliberate care he always used. It was second nature by now, protecting those documents, as if they were the last tether to the man he'd been. He didn't expect anything from this visit. He hadn't for years. But he came anyway, because giving up wasn't in him. Then the doors opened again, and the room shifted. The sound of polished dress boots echoed on the tile, deliberate and commanding. Sam turned, his eyes narrowing as a tall figure stepped into the lobby. The man's uniform was pristine, metals glinting in the sharp daylight that poured through the windows. 4 silver stars gleamed on each collar, marking him as a general. Sam stood slowly, his knees protesting, his hand tightening around the folder. The man walked past the security desk, past the reception counter, past the staff frozen in place, their eyes wide with awe or fear, or both. He moved with purpose, straight towards Sam. General Richard T. Halverson stopped just a few feet away, his hat tucked under one arm, his posture as steady as it had been decades ago in the jungle. Sam didn't recognize him at first, not the face, not the name. The years had changed them both, carving lines into their skin and gray into their hair. But there was something in the general's eyes, a glint of recognition, of gratitude, that reached back to 1968, to a moment when Sam had refused to leave a wounded man behind. The room went still, the air heavy with the weight of history. Sam's heart thudded in his chest, a quiet question forming in his mind. Who is this man, and why is he looking at me like I'm someone he notes? Back in the office, Ron Hastings sat frozen, the folder still unopened in his hands. The general's final words echoed in his mind. Just because a man walks in quietly doesn't mean he didn't once walk through hell. Ron's throat tightened as he thought of Sam Carter, of the courage it must have taken to carry a man through a war zone to save a life while bleeding out himself. He thought of the years Sam had spent carrying that folder, quietly fighting for recognition, only to be met with disbelief. Ron's fingers finally moved, opening the folder to reveal the documents inside. Yellowed pages, faded ink, but undeniable proof of a hero's service. His eyes scanned the words, and for the first time he saw Sam Carter not as a name on a form, but as a man who had given everything and asked for nothing. As Ron prepared the formal letter of apology Halverson had demanded, his hand steadied, but his heart didn't. He knew the letter was just a start, a small gesture to right a wrong that had festered for decades. Across town, Sam Carter stood face to face with the general, unaware that his name was being spoken again, not in whispers of doubt, but in voices of respect. For the first time in years, the world was remembering who he was, a Marine, a hero, a man who had walked through hell and come out the other side, carrying not just a folder, but a legacy. In the stillness of the moment, something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of recognition that reached deep into the soul. General Halverson paused before Sam Carter, his gaze steady, unyielding, as though searching for the young Marine he'd once known in a jungle half a world away. Without a word, the 4-star general snapped to attention, his salute crisp and deliberate, a gesture carved from decades of discipline and reverence. The bustling lobby of the Lexington VA hospital fell silent, as if time itself held its breath. One by one, onlookers rose to their feet, not out of obligation, but because they sensed the weight of something sacred unfolding before them. Sam's hand trembled, his heart caught in his throat, a storm of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. For a fleeting moment, he was frozen, unable to respond. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, he raised his hand, returning the salute, not as the wary man he'd become, but as the Marine he'd always been. In that instant, a part of him long buried stirred back to life, and for the first time in decades, he felt the pride of his service flood through him like a tide. The marble-floored lobby of the Lexington VA had never witnessed such a gathering. Rows of folding chairs stood in neat formation before the legacy wall, a solemn corridor adorned with framed portraits and bronze plaques honoring the region's most distinguished veterans. American flags flanked the podium, their stars gleaming under the soft light. News cameras lined the back, their lenses trained on the scene, while a military color guard stood in pristine dress uniforms near the entrance, their presence a silent tribute. At the heart of it all stood Sam Carter, his shoulders squared, his face freshly shaven, his old overcoat traded for a sharp navy blazer adorned with a small, proud pith Marine who had first donned the uniform decades ago. He stood tall, feet planted firmly, his presence commanding without a single word. The legacy wall spoke for him now, its bronze and stone bearing witness to a truth long buried. In the weeks that followed, Fridays at the Lexington VA took on a quieter but deeper significance. Sam Carter returned each week, not for fanfare or recognition, but because this place, once a backdrop to his invisibility, had become a home of sorts. The cameras were gone, the ceremonies over, but Sam's presence still drew attention, not from reporters, but from those who mattered most, the veterans. In the small common area beside the legacy wall, he'd pull up a chair, pour himself a modest cup of coffee from the communal pot, and sit among the younger men and women who carried their own scars, some visible, others buried deep. He didn't preach or lecture, he listened. His weathered face, lined with the weight of years, softened as he heard their stories, tales of loss, of survival, of searching for meaning in a world that often looked away. Sometimes he'd share a memory of his own, his voice low and steady, painting vivid pictures of jungles and snow, of brotherhood and sacrifice. Other times, a quiet nod was enough, a silent acknowledgement that he understood their pain, their pride, their struggle to be seen. For those who felt lost, sitting beside Sam was like finding an anchor, a reminder that they too were more than their scars, more than their silence. In his presence, they felt like Marines, soldiers, sailors, heroes, not because of what they'd done, but because of who they were. Across from him, Rachel Monroe sat with a quiet confidence, her name badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Case Officer R. Monroe. The promotion to a full-time position had come swiftly after the ceremony, a recognition that felt both inevitable and hard-won. Nobody spoke of it outright, but the weight of her dedication hung in the air, as clear as the polished bronze plaque on the wall. She and Sam Carter shared their weekly walks through the building's long corridors, their footsteps echoing softly against the tiled floors. Words were sparse between them, not out of discomfort, but because their connection ran deeper than small talk could touch. It was a bond carved from shared truth, from the raw cost of unearthing it, a silent understanding that needed no explanation. On a crisp Friday morning, the lobby buzzed with the chatter of eighth graders on a field trip, their sneakers squeaking as they followed their teacher toward the legacy wall. The group paused before the new bronze plaque etched with Sam's name, Sergeant Samuel Carter. The teacher's voice dropped to a reverent whisper as she pointed, her words careful but proud. "That's him," she said, gesturing toward Sam, who sat quietly nearby, his weathered hands folded in his lap. The students turned, their eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and awe, taking in the man whose name now gleamed in the morning light. Rachel, standing close, leaned down to a girl with braided hair and a curious gaze. "He saved a general's life before you were born," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of the story. "Walked straight through gunfire to carry someone to safety." The girl's eyes darted to Sam, then back to the plaque, her mind piecing together the enormity of it. A boy with oversized glasses, his backpack slung low, stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did it hurt?" he asked, his question trembling with the vulnerability of youth. Sam's face softened, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, not at the question itself, but at the courage it took to ask it aloud. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady but warm. "It hurt." The boy hesitated, then pressed on. "Were you scared?" Sam's nod was slow, deliberate, his eyes meeting the boy's with a quiet honesty. "Of course I was," he admitted, the lines on his face deepening with the memory. "But you still did it," the boy said almost to himself, as if trying to understand the gap between fear and action. Sam's gaze softened further, the weight of years reflected in his eyes. "I did it anyway," he said, his words simple but heavy with meaning. The boy stood there for a moment, processing, then raised his hand in a small, awkward salute, his fingers trembling slightly. Sam returned it with a slow, steady motion, his hands steady despite the years. The gesture was a bridge between them, a quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than words could. As the group moved on, the boy kept glancing back over his shoulder, his eyes lingering on Sam, as if trying to memorize the man behind the plaque. Sam settled back onto the bench beside Rachel, the air between them settling into a familiar quiet. "You think it matters?" he asked, his voice low, tinged with a flicker of doubt. Rachel's smile was gentle but certain. "They'll remember," she said. And in her tone, Sam found a reassurance he hadn't realized he needed. He believed her, not because he wanted to, but because her words felt like truth. Later, Rachel stood alone before the legacy wall, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze fixed on the bronze plaque bearing Sam's name. The lobby hummed softly behind her, visitors in crisp uniforms, parents with children trailing behind, all drawn to the wall's quiet gravity. Some paused to read the inscription, their fingers tracing the engraved letters, unaware of how close this tribute had come to never existing. Rachel's voice was soft but steady as she spoke, almost to herself. "He never asked for recognition," she said, her words heavy with admiration. "Not once, never raised his voice, never demanded a thing. All he wanted was for the truth to be remembered, for his story not to fade into oblivion." Her eyes lingered on the plaque, and in that moment she felt the weight of Sam's sacrifice. Not just the act that earned him this honor, but the decades of silence that followed. She turned slightly, her gaze shifting as if addressing an unseen audience. "I've worked here long enough to know Sam isn't alone," she said, her voice gaining strength. "There are others, men and women whose stories are buried beneath stacks of paperwork, lost in systems that prioritize numbers over memory. Their sacrifices, their courage, reduced to files in a cabinet or entries in a database." She paused, her breath catching as she thought of the countless names that might never see a plaque, the lives that carried the weight of wars long past. "How many more are out there?" she asked, her voice quieter now, almost pleading. "How many sit in lobbies like this, carrying their stories in silence, waiting for someone to notice? How many walked through fire only to return to a world that didn't know how to welcome them home?" Rachel stepped back, letting the legacy wall stand alone in its quiet dignity. "If you know someone like Sam," she said, her voice steady with purpose, "someone whose story was overlooked, erased, or never told, share their name. Write a few lines about them, because someone somewhere needs to hear it." Her eyes flickered downward for a moment, a brief glimpse of vulnerability, before she looked up again, her conviction unshaken. "This is about remembering. Not just the heroes with medals and monuments, but the ones who came home quietly, who never got the welcome they deserved. Let's functionalize that to them now." The moment lingered, underscored by a gentle swell of music, as the scene shifted to Sam seated on the bench, a small child beside him clutching a tiny flag, its colors bright against the muted tones of the lobby. His weathered hand rested lightly on the bench, his posture calm, but carrying the weight of a life fully lived. The image was a quiet testament to resilience, to the power of memory preserved. Rachel's voice carried on, soft but resolute. "If this story moves you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Remembering isn't just respect, it's healing. A small gesture like a child's salute can ripple across generations." She paused, letting the words settle. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering."